It was a slow Tuesday morning at a luxury car dealership in Los Angeles. The sky was gray and most of the staff were still yawning from the weekend. Only a few customers had walked in so far, and none of them seemed serious about buying anything. Some were just looking around, taking selfies next to expensive cars they couldn't afford. Others asked questions but left quickly when they heard the prices. The showroom, filled with glossy sports cars and shiny rims, felt like a museum of speed and style. At around 10:15 a.m., the glass doors opened again and a man stepped inside. He looked nothing like the usual customers. He was wearing an old hoodie with the sleeves pulled up, a pair of faded jeans, and worn-out boots. His hair was a little messy, and he had a quiet, almost invisible presence. He didn't walk with confidence, nor did he carry anything flashy. No designer sunglasses, no gold watch, not even a phone in his hand. The sales staff noticed him but didn't say anything at first. They had seen people like him before, or so they thought. Probably another window shopper, one of them whispered, looking at his clothes. Or worse, a guy just trying to feel rich for a few minutes, another joked. But one young salesman named Rick couldn't help himself. He was new, sharp-tongued, and always trying to impress his co-workers. He had slicked back hair, a shiny watch, and a habit of talking too loudly. He walked over to the man with a fake smile on his face. "Hey there, buddy," Rick said, with a voice full of sarcasm. "You sure you're in the right place?" The man turned and gave a small smile. His eyes were kind but tired. He didn't look offended, just calm. "I was hoping to take a look at the Porsche models," he said softly, almost like he didn't want to bother anyone. Rick raised an eyebrow. "The Porsches, huh?" He laughed a little, looking over at his co-workers. "Well, you can find them in the back if you're just browsing." The man nodded politely and started walking toward the back of the showroom. He didn't seem upset by Rick's tone, and he didn't rush. He walked slowly, taking his time to look at each car. He didn't touch anything, but his eyes carefully studied the designs, the details, the shape of each model. Rick walked back to his team, shaking his head. "Can you believe that guy," he whispered, "thinks he's going to buy a Porsche looking like he just rolled out of a bus stop?" They laughed quietly, watching the man from a distance. Rick made more comments, none of them kind, and all of them based only on what the man looked like. Meanwhile, the man continued to move from one car to another. He stopped at a black Porsche 911 and stared at it for a long time. He crouched slightly to look at the wheels, then straightened up and admired the curve of the cars. He looked like someone who truly appreciated cars, not just for their price, but for the beauty and engineering. After a few minutes, he returned to Rick, who had now taken a seat near the customer lounge, looking bored. "I'd like to ask about the 911 GT3, the man said quietly. "Could I see the interior?" Rick gave a forced smile. "That one's pretty high-end," he said with a shrug. "Maybe you'd like to check out the used section first. You know, just to compare." The man didn't argue. He just smiled again, as if he had heard that kind of comment many times before. At that exact moment, the showroom manager came out from his office holding a folder. He stopped mid-step, blinked, and looked toward the man. A second passed before his eyes went wide in recognition. He quickly walked over, face changing from confusion to shock to respect. "Mr. Reeves," the manager said, reaching out to shake the man's hand. "We had no idea you were stopping by today." Suddenly the room fell silent. Rick froze and his mouth slowly opened in disbelief. The man he had just mocked, called Buddy, laughed at, and treated like a joke, was none other than Keanu Reeves, one of the most beloved and respected actors in Hollywood. The manager turned to Rick and gave him a sharp look, but said, "Nothing." Keanu, as calm as ever, nodded and replied, "I was in the neighborhood, thought I'd stop by and look around a bit." Rick felt like the floor had disappeared under his feet. He looked down at his shoes, embarrassed, not knowing what to say. The co-workers who had laughed with him now looked away, pretending they hadn't said anything. The energy in the room had changed completely. People who had ignored the man were now standing straighter, trying to act helpful, but Keanu didn't seem angry. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even frown. He just continued to browse the cars, this time with the full attention of the entire staff. And Rick? He wished more than anything that he could go back in time and take back everything he had said. Rick couldn't focus. His hands were shaking slightly as he stood near the coffee counter, pretending to look busy. Just a few minutes ago, he had mocked a man who turned out to be Keanu Reeves, one of the most humble and well-respected actors in the world. And now, that same man was calmly walking around the showroom looking at different cars like nothing had happened. Rick had always been quick to judge people by how they looked. In his short time at the dealership, he had learned one thing. If someone came in wearing expensive clothes and a designer watch, they were probably a serious buyer. But if someone came in wearing simple or old clothes, they were just browsing. That's what Rick believed, and he had never been proven wrong. Until today, he kept glancing at Keanu, who was now speaking with another salesperson, an older gentleman named Marco. Marco had been at the dealership for over 15 years, and he treated everyone the same whether they wore a suit or slippers. That's why Keanu asked for someone else to help him. Someone respectful, someone kind. And Marco was the perfect choice. Rick felt his face burn with shame as he remembered what he had said earlier. "You sure you're in the right place?" he had joked, thinking he was clever. Now it sounded like the most foolish thing in the world. Marco showed Keanu the Porsche 911 GT3 with professionalism and respect. He explained every detail with patience, not once acting surprised or fake. Keanu nodded quietly, asking a few questions here and there. He wasn't loud, he didn't try to show off, he was just normal. Rick's co-workers started whispering among themselves. "That's really him," one said. "Keanu Reeves, right here," another replied. "Rick messed up so bad," someone else added. Rick pretended not to hear, but every word hit him like a rock. A woman and her teenage son, who were also in the showroom, walked over to Keanu and shyly asked for a photo. He smiled, said of course, and took a picture with them. Then he thanked them politely as if they had done him a favor. Rick couldn't believe it. Here was a man who could buy 10 cars in a single visit, and he wasn't acting like he was better than anyone. He wasn't rude, wasn't arrogant, he was the complete opposite of what Rick had expected. Meanwhile, the dealership manager stood near his office, arms crossed, watching everything. He didn't say anything to Rick yet, but Rick could tell something was coming. Maybe a warning, or even worse. Maybe he'd be fired. Rick slowly walked toward the water cooler, trying to stay out of everyone's way. He watched as Marco opened the car door for Keanu and invited him to sit inside. Keanu sat quietly behind the wheel, gently touching the steering wheel. He didn't start the engine, didn't make noise, just closed his eyes for a second, and smiled. "He really loves cars," someone whispered, and Rick could see that it was true. This wasn't just about money or fame for Keanu. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here because he appreciated the car, the design, the power, the feeling of being inside it. Rick thought about all the customers he had treated badly. In the past, people he had ignored just because of their clothes or shoes. What if some of them were important too? What if they had come back to buy, but never did, because of how he made them feel? The thought made Rick feel even worse. He remembered one man who had walked in last month wearing an old baseball cap and asking about a used BMW. Rick had laughed and told him the prices were probably out of his league. That man had quietly left, and Rick never thought about it again. Until now. Now he wondered how many people had been silently hurt by his words. How many chances he had lost just because he assumed things. Keanu stepped out of the car and thanked Marco. "I like this one," he said. "Might take it." Rick felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. How could someone so famous, so rich, be so calm, so humble, so human? He had seen celebrities on TV throwing tantrums over small things, but Keanu, he had been mocked, insulted, and still chose kindness. Rick looked around at the other salespeople. Most of them were now trying to be extra friendly to Keanu, offering him coffee, opening doors, smiling too wide. But it was too late. Keanu wasn't someone who cared about fake kindness. He had already chosen who to trust, and that person wasn't Rick. Rick sighed and sat down on a bench near the back wall. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel like blaming anyone else. For the first time in a long time, he felt something else. Guilt. Real and heavy. The lesson was clear, and it was written all over the room. Never judge someone by their appearance, because the quietest person in the room might be the one with the biggest story. And in Rick's case, The man in the old hoodie turned out to be a legend. The air inside the showroom felt different now. The mood had shifted completely. What started as a normal, lazy morning had turned into something everyone would remember. Rick stood frozen in place, still trying to process what had just happened. Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in the world, was standing only a few feet away from him. And Rick had treated him like a nobody. Just minutes earlier, Rick had mocked the man in front of other employees, laughing about his clothes, speaking rudely and assuming he was too poor to buy a car. Now he stood there, watching the dealership manager shake hands with Keanu with full respect and a little nervousness in his voice. "Mr. Reeves, I had no idea you were stopping by today," the manager said, trying to stay calm. Keanu gave a small smile, the same gentle smile he had shown earlier when Rick treated him badly. "I was in the area," Keanu said simply. "Thought I'd look around without being noticed." The manager nodded quickly. Of course, you're always welcome here," he said. "Is there anything I can help you with personally?" Keanu glanced around the room, then looked at Rick for a moment. Rick could barely meet his eyes. He felt like he wanted to disappear. "I'd prefer if someone else helped me," Keanu said kindly but clearly. "Maybe someone who isn't in such a hurry to judge people." There was no anger in his voice, no yelling, no attitude. He wasn't trying to get revenge, he was just calmly setting a boundary. The words hit Rick harder than a slap, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. The manager quickly called over Marco, one of the most respected and kindest salespeople at the dealership. "Marco, could you please assist Mr. Reeves?" he asked. "Of course," Marco replied with a warm smile. He walked over to Keanu and said, "It's an honor, sir. Let me show you the best we have." Rick watched the scene unfold like a movie. But this time, he wasn't the star. He wasn't even in the background. He was the one who had made the mistake everyone saw. Some of the other employees started whispering again, but this time, there was no laughter, only quiet shock, embarrassment, and maybe a little fear that the same thing could have happened to them. Keanu walked calmly with Marco toward the black Porsche 911 GT3, the same car he had been interested in before Rick brushed him off. He didn't act like a celebrity, he didn't expect special treatment. Even now, after the truth was out, he wasn't showing off or making demands. He just quietly followed Marco and asked questions about the car. Rick wanted to say something, an apology, a word of regret, anything. But his throat felt dry. What could he possibly say now? Sorry for judging you. Sorry for laughing at your clothes. Sorry for not recognizing the kindest man in Hollywood when he stood right in front of me. He stayed quiet, hoping that maybe, somehow, this would all go away, but it didn't. Keanu sat inside the car while Marco explained the features. He listened closely, nodding and showing genuine interest. He wasn't pretending. He truly loved the car. Other customers in the showroom had also realized who he was. Some looked from a distance with awe. Others smiled and whispered to each other. One or two even stepped outside to call friends and tell them, "You won't believe who's here." Rick remained standing, still as a statue, watching the man he had mocked now being treated with the respect he deserved. He thought about the first thing he said to Keanu. "You sure you're in the right place?" The words echoed in his mind like a cruel joke, and now it was clear who had really been out of place. It wasn't Keanu. It was Rick and his attitude, the worst part. Keanu had never raised his voice, never insulted him back, never told the manager to fire him. He had just smiled, asked for someone else, and continued shopping as if nothing happened. That kind of self-control, that kind of grace, it shook Rick to the core. People say you learn who someone really is when they have power, and Keanu had more power than anyone in that room. But he used it not to hurt, not to show off, but to stay humble. As Keanu stepped out of the Porsche and spoke softly with Marco, Rick knew this moment had changed something deep inside him. He had learned a lesson that no training, no sales pitch, no book could ever teach. It was a lesson about respect, about kindness, and about the danger of judging someone too quickly. Keanu looked around the showroom one last time, then met Rick's eyes. For a brief second, there was no hate in that look, only understanding and maybe a hint of sadness. Then he turned away, and the moment passed. Rick stood there quietly, knowing this was not the end of the story but just the beginning of a hard, necessary change within himself. Even after everything that had happened, Keanu Reeves didn't seem angry. He had been laughed at, misjudged, and treated like he didn't belong. But he still stood there calmly, with the same quiet smile on his face. It was as if the rude words hadn't touched him at all. Or maybe he had just learned how to handle that kind of behavior with patience. Most people in his place would have shouted, complained, or stormed out. But Keanu didn't do any of that. He didn't embarrass Rick in front of everyone. He didn't demand special treatment. Instead, he had only asked for someone else to help him. Someone who didn't judge people based on their clothes or looks. The dealership manager, still trying to fix the situation, asked Keanu if he'd like to speak to him directly, or have a private room to wait in. Keanu shook his head gently. "I'm okay. I just want to look at the car," he said. It was such a simple request, but it showed something powerful. Keanu didn't want attention. He didn't want people rushing around or pretending to be nice. Just because he was famous, all he wanted was to be treated like a regular person, like anyone else who walks into a store. Marco, the older and kind-hearted salesman, stayed by Keanu's side. He spoke with respect but not fear, and Keanu appreciated that. The two of them walked slowly around the Porsche again, talking about the features, engine, and design. Keanu even asked questions that showed he knew a lot about cars, not just as a buyer but as a fan. Meanwhile, Rick stood near the counter, his head slightly down. He watched everything from a distance. His co-workers didn't talk to him, and no one laughed anymore. The mood had changed, and Rick knew he was the reason why. Rick's pride was gone, completely crushed by the weight of his own behavior. But what made it even worse was how kind Keanu continued to be. There was no revenge, no punishment, no drama, just grace, quiet and strong. At one point, Keanu turned to the manager and said, "Your staff is good, but I think some of them might need to remember that not everyone who comes in here wants to show off." He didn't even mention Rick's name. He didn't have to. Everyone already knew what had happened. The manager nodded, clearly embarrassed, and promised to speak with his team later. Keanu didn't push. He just said, "It's all right. I've met people like that before. It's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last." His words weren't bitter. They were real. They came from experience, from a life where people had looked at his clothes or his silence and made the wrong assumptions. Keanu was known around Hollywood not just for his acting, but for how he treated people. Stories about him riding the subway, helping film crew members carry equipment, and giving money to sick children had been told online for years. And now everyone in the dealership was seeing that kindness with their own eyes. He had the power to make someone lose their job that day, but he chose not to use it. He chose understanding over punishment, humility over pride. After spending more time with Marco, Keanu said, "I think I've made my decision." The manager offered to handle the payment or bring the car around back, but Keanu replied, "Marco's helping me. Let's keep it simple." He turned to Marco and said, "I'll take the 911 GT3, the black one." Marco smiled. "Excellent choice, sir." Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet. There were no gold cards or flashy stacks of cash, just a clean, quiet method of doing business. He didn't ask for discounts, didn't argue about price. He paid in full without hesitation. After everything, after being judged and laughed at, he still bought the car. Not to prove a point, but because he had already decided he wanted it. Rick watched as the payment went through, and Keanu shook hands with Marco. Then, something even more surprising happened. Keanu walked toward the front desk where a young janitor was cleaning the floor near the door. He stopped and spoke to him for a minute. Then he pulled something out of his wallet. A tip, generous and unexpected. He smiled and said, "Thanks for keeping the place clean." The janitor, shocked and speechless, just nodded with wide eyes. Before leaving, Keanu turned to the manager and said, "If possible, could you split a small bonus among the support staff here?" The people who aren't always noticed. The manager agreed at once, amazed by what he had just heard. And then, as quietly as he had arrived, Keanu walked toward the exit, not waiting for applause, not looking for attention. He opened the door, Himself gave one last polite nod and disappeared into the street. No cameras, no crowd, no red carpet. Just a man who came to buy a car and left behind a lesson in grace, in humility, and in how true strength doesn't need to shout. Rick stood still, frozen like a statue, even after Keanu Reeves had left the showroom. The sound of the door closing behind him felt louder than usual, as if it had shut on something more than just the day. It had closed on Rick's pride, his ego, and the person he had been just an hour ago. Everything around Rick continued as normal, but inside him nothing felt the same. The laughter from earlier had vanished, the jokes, the smirks, the overconfidence. They were all gone, left behind, like dust in the corner of the showroom. Rick stared at the glass door where Keanu had just walked out, replaying everything in his mind. The moment he saw him walk in, the way he looked, the way he spoke, how Rick had mocked him in front of others, called him buddy, offered him used cars and assumed he was just a time waster. He remembered laughing, rolling his eyes, showing off to his co-workers, thinking he was clever. And now all of it felt wrong, deeply wrong. Keanu hadn't said much, but his silence had spoken. Louder than any words, he didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't demand an apology. He simply showed the difference between someone with class and someone still learning what respect really means. Rick felt something heavy growing in his chest. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was guilt, pure and painful. He turned his head, slowly, and looked at Marco, who was still standing near the Porsche Keanu had just bought. Marco was calm, respectful as always, doing his job with pride. Keanu had chosen him, trusted him, appreciated him, and Rick knew why. Marco had treated Keanu like a person, not like a sale, not like a paycheck, but like someone who deserved kindness, no matter how he dressed or spoke. Rick sat down on a small bench in the corner of the dealership. Far from the others, he needed space to think. He needed to face himself. For the first time in his life, Rick saw the real meaning of judgment. He had always believed he was just being smart, sorting serious buyers from the ones who didn't matter. He thought he was saving time, but in reality, he had been turning people away without ever giving them a chance. He remembered an older woman who came in last month wearing a simple sweater and carrying a cloth handbag. He had brushed her off too, assuming she couldn't afford anything. But later, she came back with her son, and they bought a BMW from another salesperson. Rick had lost the sale, and he hadn't even realized why. Now he knew. The worst part wasn't that he had lost a sale to Keanu Reeves. It wasn't even that his co-workers had seen it happen. The worst part was knowing he had hurt someone who did nothing wrong, someone who came in kindly, quietly, and left just the same. Keanu could have humiliated him in front of everyone, but he didn't. He could have demanded Rick be fired, but he didn't. He could have shouted or complained, but he didn't. He simply walked away, leaving behind a mirror for Rick to look into. Rick didn't like what he saw in that mirror. Across the room, one of the junior staff members walked by and gave Rick a quick look, not with laughter or mockery, but something else. It was pity, and that felt even worse. Rick took out his phone and searched Keanu Reeves' kindness. The internet was full of stories. One article said he gave away millions to hospital charities. Another said he gave up his own salary so that the special effects team could be paid better. There were pictures of him riding the subway, helping people with groceries, sitting with homeless people on the street. Each story Rick read made him feel smaller, but strangely, not in a hopeless way. It was painful, but it was also eye-opening. Keanu wasn't just a movie star. He was a good man, a rare kind of human, and Rick, he didn't want to be the kind of person who judged people by their shoes anymore. He didn't want to be someone who missed the heart behind the hoodie. That night, after the dealership closed, Rick stayed behind. He swept the floor quietly. Even though it wasn't his job, he thought about the janitor who had received a tip from Keanu earlier, the only person in the building who didn't expect anything, but still got noticed. Rick sat down again, this time with a notebook. He began writing, not to complain or explain, but to reflect. He wrote about what he had done, what he had learned, and why he wanted to change. He wasn't sure if anyone would read it. but he knew he had to write it anyway. Not for the internet, not for his coworkers, for himself. He didn't want to be remembered as the guy who mocked Keanu Reeves. He wanted to become the man who had learned from him, quietly, deeply, and honestly. And so, with a heavy heart but an open mind, Rick closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and stepped out of the showroom. Not just as a salesman, but as someone trying to become better. The next morning, the showroom felt brighter than usual. The sunlight poured through the glass windows and bounced off the polished cars. But for the employees inside, especially Rick, things still felt heavy. Yesterday's events had left a mark, a quiet, powerful memory that none of them could forget. Rick arrived earlier than usual. He didn't want to be late, not today. He walked in with his head down and his thoughts spinning. He had spent most of the night thinking about what happened, replaying Keanu's words and actions over and over again in his mind. He knew he had failed. Not just as a salesman, but as a human being. When he walked into the showroom, he saw the black Porsche 911 GT3 parked neatly in the pickup zone. Its surface gleamed like black glass, sleek and elegant. Everyone knew whose car it was now. Keanu had bought it, paid in full, and quietly left, leaving behind a silent storm of emotion and realization. But even though the car was ready to be delivered, something else had changed since yesterday. The energy in the room was different. The staff spoke more softly, more respectfully. It was as if Keanu's visit had cleaned the air and reminded everyone of something important. Rick walked past the car and stopped for a moment to admire it. He had seen hundreds of cars in his career, but this one now felt special. Not because of the brand or the price, but because of the story behind it. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol of humility, patience, and quiet power. He looked at the passenger seat, remembering how Keanu sat there silently, listening, nodding, showing genuine interest in the features, not trying to impress anyone, just being himself. And then Rick thought about the words Keanu said before he left. No hard feelings, just remember, you never know who's walking in. Those words had stayed in Rick's heart like a gentle echo. They didn't sound angry. They weren't said to shame him. They were just honest, kind advice from someone who had every reason to be upset, but chose not to be. The dealership manager came over and patted Rick on the shoulder. Learned something, didn't you? He asked softly. Rick nodded. More than just something, he replied. I think I learned everything I should have known already. The manager didn't scold him. He had already seen how much Rick had changed in one day. Sometimes one mistake can teach more than 100 good days, and Rick had clearly learned his lesson. Later that afternoon, a driver from Keanu's team arrived to pick up the car. He handed over the final paperwork and a short note addressed to the staff. The note was handwritten, simple and clear. Thanks for your time. The car is beautiful. Please make sure the support team and janitorial staff receive their share of the bonus. Appreciate your work. Stay kind. Keanu. Everyone read the note in silence and then passed it to the next person. It wasn't just a thank you note. It was a message. A reminder that even in a world full of noise and pride, kindness still mattered the most. Rick looked at the janitor, who was again quietly sweeping the floor near the exit. He remembered how Keanu had walked up to him, handed him a generous tip and thanked him personally. No cameras, no witnesses, just respect for a man doing his job. That moment stayed in Rick's mind more than anything else. It showed him that kindness wasn't something you saved for the rich or the famous. It was something you gave freely to everyone, no matter their role, no matter their clothes. Rick stood near the car as the keys were handed over to the driver. He didn't speak, didn't move much. He just watched as the Porsche slowly rolled out of the dealership and disappeared down the road. He felt like he was watching a chapter close, but not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something better, not just for him, but maybe for the whole team. One of the other employees, who had laughed along with Rick the day before, came over and said, I think that man taught us all something without even trying. Rick nodded. Yeah, he did. And the best part? He didn't do it with anger. He did it with grace. Rick walked back to his desk, not to sit down and sell cars, but to take a notebook from his drawer. He opened it to the first page and wrote one line. Don't sell to the clothes. Talk. To the person, it was a new rule for himself, one he would never break again. From that day on, every person who walked through those glass doors got the same greeting from Rick. No judgment, no assumptions, just a smile and a simple question. How can I help you today? Because now Rick understood something deep and real. You never truly know someone's story just by looking at them, and sometimes the person who changes your life forever might walk in wearing old boots and a hoodie. That night, Rick didn't go out with his coworkers like he usually did. He didn't scroll through his phone or watch TV. He just sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling. The events of the past 2 days kept playing in his mind, one scene after another like a movie stuck on repeat. He saw Keanu Reeves walking into the showroom in quiet clothes. He remembered the way he had smirked at him, the way he'd whispered to his coworker, "Look at this guy, probably just killing time." At the time it had felt like nothing, just another casual joke. But now, it felt like a slap across the face. He thought about how Keanu could have reacted. He could have caused a scene, called for the manager, shouted about being insulted. But he hadn't. He had just asked for someone else to help him, not with anger, but with calm dignity. Rick had never felt so small in his life. Not because Keanu was rich or famous, but because Keanu had every right to be rude back, but chose not to be. That's what hurt the most. The kindness, the grace, the self-control. It made Rick feel ashamed of the person he had been. He walked over to his desk and opened his laptop. Then he clicked on a blank post on his social media page. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. He didn't want to make excuses. He didn't want to defend himself. He just wanted to be honest. So he began to type, slowly with care, line by line. "Yesterday, I made a mistake, a big one. I judged someone by how they looked. I laughed at them, talked down to them, and treated them like they didn't belong. But that man was Keanu Reeves, and even after the way I treated him, he showed me nothing but respect." Rick paused and stared at the screen. The words were honest, and they stung, but it felt right. It felt like something he needed to say, not for likes or attention, but because it was the truth. He continued, "I could have apologized in private, but I think the lesson is too big to keep to myself. We talk so much about being kind, but sometimes we forget to practice it, especially when we think no one is watching." Keanu was watching, not just me, but all of us. And instead of getting angry, he taught me a lesson I'll never forget. He read over his post 3 times, then hit publish. Rick closed the laptop and sat back. His heart was beating a little faster. He didn't know what people would say. He wasn't doing this for sympathy. He just wanted to face his mistake, to own it. The next morning when he woke up, his phone was buzzing. At first he thought it was just another spam call, but then he saw the notifications, hundreds of them. People from all over were commenting, sharing, and responding to his post. Some were angry, some were supportive. Many said they respected him for telling the truth. Others shared their own stories of being judged unfairly. Rick read every comment one by one. Some made him tear up, some made him smile, but all of them reminded him that the world was full of people just trying to be seen, trying to be heard. Later, that day while he was at work, his manager called him into the office. Rick expected to be scolded again, or maybe even let go, but instead the manager handed him a small envelope. "There's something you should see," he said. Rick opened it and found a note, handwritten and simple. It said, "Appreciate the apology. No hard feelings. Keep being better. Keanu." Rick's hands trembled as he held the paper. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't dramatic, but it meant everything. Keanu had seen the post, he had read the words, and instead of ignoring it or responding with coldness, he had done what he always did, responded with grace. Rick walked out of the office in silence, the paper still in his hand. He folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet, a place where he would see it every day, not to remind him of his mistake, but to remind him of the change it brought. From that moment, Rick knew his life had taken a new turn. He didn't just want to sell cars anymore, he wanted to sell them the right way, with respect, with honesty, with care. He greeted each customer with a smile, Not a fake one, but a real one. He asked questions, listened closely, and treated every person like they mattered because now he knew they did. Keanu Reeves had walked into his life for less than an hour, but he had left behind a lesson that would last a lifetime. Days passed, but the memory of Keanu Reeves's visit stayed fresh in Rick's mind. It wasn't just a strange or surprising moment anymore. It had turned into something bigger, a quiet turning point in his life. Rick still worked at the same dealership, still wore the same clothes, still stood at the same counter every day. But something inside him had changed deeply and permanently. He was no longer the same guy who judged people by what they wore or how they looked. He had seen what real class looked like, not in a movie, not on TV, but right in front of him, in a man who chose kindness over ego, respect over revenge. The online post Rick had written had gone viral. Thousands of people had seen it, shared it, and talked about it. Some called it brave. Others called it honest. Many said it reminded them not to judge others so quickly. But Rick didn't care about the likes or the shares. He cared about the lesson. And more than anything, he cared about doing better from now on. One afternoon, about a week after everything had happened, a woman walked into the showroom. She was elderly, wearing a plain shawl and carrying a small handbag. Her shoes looked old, and her coat was too big for her frame. In the past, Rick might have looked at her and assumed she was just passing time, but now, he smiled warmly and walked right over. "Good afternoon, ma'am, welcome. How can I help you today?" The woman looked a little surprised, but then smiled back. "I just came to look," she said gently. "I've never been in a place like this before." Rick nodded. "Then let me show you around. You're more than welcome here." He gave her a tour of the showroom, explained things clearly, answered every question, and even helped her sit inside one of the cars so she could see what it felt like. She didn't buy anything that day, but when she left, she looked happy, respected and seen. Later that evening, as Rick was getting ready to close, his manager walked over. "You've changed," he said simply. "In a good way." Rick smiled. "I just finally understood what this job is really about." A few days later, another surprise came his way. A letter arrived at the dealership. No fancy envelope, no big company logo, just a simple card with neat handwriting. It was from Keanu's team again inside, it said. "Thank you for sharing your story. Most people hide their mistakes. You didn't. That takes courage. We all mess up sometimes, but not everyone chooses to grow from it." Rick held the card in his hands and felt something rise in his chest. Not pride, but peace. He had made a mistake, but he hadn't run from it. He had faced it. And now he was moving forward, slowly but surely. Over time, customers started to notice the difference in him. They often complimented his honesty, his patience, and his willingness to listen. He didn't just sell cars anymore. He connected with people. One day, a teenager walked in with his father. They were looking for a used car. Rick treated them with the same care and attention as anyone else. He helped them find a reliable, affordable model and made sure they felt confident in their choice. Before leaving, the father shook Rick's hand and said, "You've got a good heart. That's rare in this business." Rick smiled, and for the first time in a long while, he truly believed it. At his desk, he kept two things. One was a photo of the black Porsche 911 GT3, the car Keanu had bought. The other was the handwritten note Keanu had sent. Both reminders sat quietly under the glass of his table, not for show, but for purpose. Sometimes his coworkers would glance at them and nod. They all knew what those items meant. They represented a story that had touched them all, a moment that had shifted the entire mood of the workplace. Keanu Reeves had come in for a car, but he left behind something much more valuable, a reminder that kindness costs nothing, but means everything. And Rick? He never forgot it. He often thought about that final moment, the way Keanu had turned back before leaving and said, "No hard feelings, just remember, you never know who's walking in." Those words had become a quiet guide in Rick's mind. They weren't just about customers, they were about life, about treating everyone with respect no matter how they look, no matter where they come from. Years later, when new salespeople joined the team, Rick would share the story, not to brag but to teach. He would say, There was a day I judged the wrong man and he turned out to be the best one I ever met. And every time he told it, the room would go silent, just like it had the day. Keanu walked in because the lesson was simple but powerful. Never judge too quickly, stay humble, be kind, you never know who's walking in.